that a lot of people don't pick up on those signs. They don't even think about suicide as being an issue. It's not considered to be a problem in their state or their city or wherever they live. One of the things that we find is that people are always surprised to hear that in Virginia there's about twice the number of suicides as there are homicides every year. Around 400 some homicides per year, 800 to 900 suicides per year. That ratio goes up in other states. In Minnesota, it's 4-to-1 suicides to homicides. And so a lot of times what we learn is that people don't think about that because they don't think it's really even an issue. So when someone's depressed, when someone's upset, when someone's even talking about suicide, in their mind, that's something that happens to 17-year-old kids or happens, a handful of times a year. It's very, very prevalent. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about stats tonight, and this is kind of the exciting part of the evening because everyone loves statistics. But we'll give you kind of a general scope about how suicide looks in Virginia. I'm going to be discussing the year 2007. 2008 data is done, but we're having some IT trouble getting it out. So this is our most recent year we have completed data. Just briefly to introduce what we do, we're part of the National Violent Death Reporting System. So we're one of 18 states across the country that's doing this project. And we collect information on anyone who dies in Virginia from homicide, suicide, legal intervention, undetermined death, accidental firearm death, any kind of death that kind of goes along those lines. Most of our deaths that we look at are suicides. So overall for Virginia for 2007, there were 868 suicides. And that means that there were 11.3 suicides per 100,000 persons in the population. That's the rate. So the rate is the number of people that commit suicide compared to the population. For males, the rate is 16.9 per 100,000 persons. For females, it's 5.8. And what we see throughout all states really is that the risk goes up for whites and for males, and then for white males, obviously, and then as people get older as well. So for white males, and again, the overall rate is 11.3. For white males, it's 19.6. So it essentially doubles for white males, the risk for suicide. Looking at age groups, what would you guess is the median age for a suicide victim in Virginia? What would you guess? Anyone? Median age is 46 years old for someone who commits suicide in Virginia. Persons who are 45 to 54 years of age are the largest number of persons, 204 persons in 2007. And persons who are 75 to 84 have the highest rate or the highest risk of completing suicide in Virginia. Their rate is 20.9 per 100,000 persons. Christina may talk about the non-fatal suicide, but we also want to kind of give you both sides of the picture. And persons who attempt suicide but don't die from it, and persons who die from suicide are very different in how they look and what they use and their ages and their genders and all of those things. So while we had 800 plus fatal suicides in 2007, we had 5,121 non-fatal that resulted in hospitalization. The rate for males for non-fatal is 51.7 per 100,000 persons. For females, is 80.5 per 100,000 persons. These are a lot of people. Again, the age difference shifts. For those who complete suicide, it's 46 years old is the average age. For those who have non-fatal attempts, that's 34. So once again, you're seeing a big difference between people who complete suicide and people who attempt suicide and get hospitalized as a result. In Virginia, because we're a firearm state, most of our suicides involve firearms. 54.7% of our suicides involve a firearm. This is not how it works in every state. For example, in New Jersey, their most common method is a hanging or suffocation. In Virginia, we're led by firearms. Second was poisons with 20.7%, and then hanging suffocation, which is 19.1%. And those three methods, hanging, poisons, and firearms, account for almost 95% of all suicides in Virginia that are completed. For those who use poisons, 74% were using prescription medication, usually their own prescription medication. And this becomes a real issue for prevention. You have people who are depressed, you have people who are in pain, physical pain, emotional pain, and they're getting prescribed medication that can be used to commit suicide. And so it's a real catch-22 for doctors and people who are practicing out there is what to do about this issue, because it is very easily used in that situation. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at, as well as what kind of medication is used in completing suicide. The 14 most common poisons, 5 were pain medications and 5 were mental health medications. So that tells you right off the bat that that's the most common things being used for completing suicide are prescribed drugs for pain, physical pain, emotional pain. For non-fatal suicides, firearms are much smaller. It's 1.1%. For non-fatal for poisoning, it's 78.5% of people who attempt suicide. So again, it's a complete flip around from firearms and poisons, males and females, and that is a huge difference for how things look. And so when I give you stats about what's happening for fatal suicide, it doesn't really cover those who are really at risk for injuring themselves non-fatally. It's a huge difference for those two groups. As far as like geography goes, the general rule of thumb is that the smaller the locality, the smaller number and the higher rate. So for example, Highland County, which is the smallest county in Virginia, in a 5-year period had 2 suicides, and their rate was 16.1. Fairfax County, which is the biggest county in Virginia, had 380 suicides in the same time period, and their rate was 7.6. So in general, when you get into cities, you have more because you have more people, but your rates go lower. And in general, as you go into rural areas, it's the kind of the flip around of that as well. Part of what we do with our project is collect information about why people committed suicide. We look for stats about life stressors. We look at suicide notes. We look for events that occurred directly before the suicide. So we look for people who were, for example, fighting with their wife just before they committed suicide. And you know, there's a number of things that go into this. The 3 most common that we see are mental health problems, intimate partner problems, and physical health problems. And as you can probably imagine, how those play out for people depends upon their age and their gender. So as you get older, physical health problems become more of a factor. For younger people, it's intimate partner problems. And a lot of this overlaps with alcohol and overlaps with drugs. We looked at before at suicides and looked at alcohol, for example. And people who commit suicide for having a fight with a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, the proportion of them who are using alcohol at that time is way up. It's very highly increased. So, you know, when you've had a lot of alcohol to drink, maybe you're not thinking always straight, maybe you're a little bit more sensitive than you were if you were not drinking alcohol. And so problems kind of become magnified. And so not only is it looking here for just what's going on in the person's life, you know, this week or this month, but right now. Are they drinking right now? Are they on drugs right now? Are they taking pain medication right now? Things that might impair their judgment a little bit. So some of the warning signs that we look at we look at some of the more obvious warning signs. There are more subtle warning signs, such as loss of interest in activities or not sleeping, sleeping too much, not eating. But we look at kind of the more obvious markers, and one of those is disclosing intent to commit suicide. 37% of our victims at some point told someone about suicide, either explicitly or implicitly. So they may have said, you know, next Tuesday at 4 o'clock I'm going to shoot myself. Or they may have said, I'm not going back to jail Thursday. It's not going to happen, I'm going to take care of it myself. So explicit or implicit, with time for intervention. So there was time for someone to say, let's address this problem, or let's do something about this. The other is a history of prior suicide attempts. 21.5% had a history of prior attempts. Combined, almost half of people who commit suicide in Virginia have either had tried suicide before or have talked about it openly with someone, usually with a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a parent or someone close to them in their family. One of the things that we've also learned is that persons who attempt suicide and persons who have not attempted suicide have different methods of fatal injury at the end. So what weapon they choose to commit suicide with depends a lot upon whether they've tried suicide before or not. People who have not tried to commit suicide before tend to use firearms much more often. Those who have tried tend to use poisons much more often. So as you can kind of guess, it goes along with gender. Females tend to have tried more times with poison. Males tend to more often just kind of do it once with a firearm. As persons get older, there's less prior attempts, there's more firearms, which is a more lethal method of injury. There's a reason, part of the reason why most people who have non-fatal attempts of use of poison is because of the firearm. Non-fatal attempts are kind of hard to do, frankly. I mean, it's a very lethal means of committing suicide, and so that kind of channels into the fatality rate. So, conclusion, rates are highest among whites, males, older adults, and rural residents. You combine it together, when you have white males who are older and live in rural areas, and have guns in their homes, and you go onto this list of things that are happening, they've become widowed, they've lost their spouse, they've whatever, these persons the risk becomes gigantic. And so that's a real key group to look out for. So, you know, when you have that person that you know who's out there who has these characteristics and they're starting to show these signs that maybe they're depressed, maybe they're not doing so well, that should be a real tip-off that something's not going right. Most suicides here involve a firearm, and so firearm prevention or firearm restriction can be an important part of prevention. Most have a mental health problem, and most of these persons are being treated at the time for mental health problems. So most people are actually getting treatment at the time of suicide. They're being treated with medication, counseling, so on. Nearly half talk about it or have attempted it before. And you know, basically what we want to do is be useful. So anything that you want to know more about as far as suicide, if you want statistics, you want data, my card's up here, as well as some packets that have the stats from tonight. And so if you have any information you want from me for like a report, for a class, for your policy planning, for anything at all, let me know. That's what I'm here for. It's my job. And so if I can help you out in any way, let me know, and I'll be glad to do it. Thank you very much.